I know there are people who will say that China Mobile is possibly feeding information to Huawei, or China Mobile is Huawei's biggest customer.
Yeah, as we just said, that's 60%. I think.
And also there's all these smaller little companies that we don't really know much about. I mean, Pico.com is a member, and it's as I say, it's part British, part Chinese, so it's a little bit easier to get in touch with them and have a chat. But there's a lot of very obscure companies where we don't really know what the ownership structure is and who's behind them, and possibly Huawei has something to do with them. And I find it quite hard to believe that Huawei would just go no and turn around and pretend that it's never going to happen. Because
especially not when its biggest customer's quite keen on it.
Exactly.
Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. We've got, I think we need to recap on last week. Remember last week I came in and I was like, oh no, Epsilon.
You were very depressed last week.
Well, I was still feeling a bit ill and it was like raining and windy and foul. Yeah. But that Epsilon, we thought it'd be Epsilon, but what we didn't realise, they've been racking up the Greek letters while we haven't been looking.
I didn't even know that some of these variants have gone out there and only infected like 3 people. And obviously, what it should have been was called Z, shouldn't it?
Well, that was the thing, because the Greek letter before Omicron, which is what they ended up calling, is spelled XI, Z, she, whatever. And obviously that's a bit contentious, isn't it?
Oh, Omicron is for the letter E.
No, we've already had all of that.
We're on about.
Apparently, there's loads of variants that just didn't go anywhere.
We're on about the 13th character of the Greek alphabet at this stage.
I thought it was Delta, the last one.
No, there's been lots since Delta.
It's just what I've just been saying.
So insignificant and not actually done much that they haven't
call them
to public attention. Basically,
they call them VOCs, variants of concern. Apparently,
the ones that stand out.
Yeah. Not variants of colour.
Variants of concern, yeah. So this one basically was lingering around in some poor bugger for weeks and training itself up to be super different from the rest of them.
I know, and so
like a Rambo moment.
Yeah, exactly. So you were telling me I was being a bit Eeyore-ish a week ago. What are you saying now?
I still don't think there'll be more restrictions than they've done, which is just face masks.
The maskiness.
I don't expect any changes.
They're threatening to fine people and stuff.
Yeah, I don't think that's good, and I don't even like the face mask stuff that much. But actually, we're still being told to wear face masks anyway, even in public transport.
I better not incriminate myself and tell them.
I'd be very, very surprised if they do anything like
most of the rest of the world.
Yeah, and that's not even driven
Central
by Omicron,
Europe.
though, is it? Though that's the thing. What's going on in Europe?
No, that's true. They've just got a surge.
They've just got a surge, and they've reacted by putting it into lockdown.
But that's my concern: is the political climate. I've noticed throughout the whole 2 years, when one country does something, it sometimes gives the green light for everyone else to give it a go. Anyway, so I still remain pessimistic. They've still plenty of time to cancel Christmas and generally arse everything up.
It's not that long now.
I'm hoping school break helps. It's 2 weeks, right? The school break.
A bit longer than that, I think.
But what's going to have to happen for them to do that? This is the thing. We've already got really high cases. Omicron's not going to make that much difference.
In England, we've been plateauing, though. It's
still very high. It's still a high number. It's been high for weeks and weeks. The important thing is it's never led to a big spike in hospitalisations. No. Unlike the rest of Europe, we seem to look at this and go, oh, here's cases, here's hospitalisations and deaths. As long as the hospitalisations and deaths are quite low, then we won't put.
I was looking at
restrictions.
The Worldometer, checking my sources here, and it's basically around. We dab with 40,000. It's gone down a bit,
yeah.
But then the deaths has gone down.
The deaths has gone down, and the hospitalisations is reasonably low compared to what it has been.
That's presumed to be down to the vaccine, although I think people underestimate natural immunity. And quite a lot of people have got it.
Is there a drug? Apparently, there's a drug now.
Well, there's always.
There are several that they can use.
There's always one. If you want to look at charts, have a look at Merck's share price.
And then the other reason why I'm optimistic is because the latest sort of studies that have been reported on in the last couple of days are that they think the vaccines are actually pretty good at preventing severe illness with Omicron. So, and that's the only important thing. As long as it prevents severe illness.
That's what Fauci was saying. As long if the vaccine is 51% effective, that's all we need to eventually.
So I'd be very, very surprised if there's any kind of. The only thing I think would change it is if there's a big increase in hospitalisations and deaths before Christmas, and I don't think that'll happen. So I don't think it's.
Yeah, they only look at.
Okay, so I'm still being the more pessimistic one. All right, well, we'll keep an eye on it.
That way you won't be disappointed.
Based on thinking that there's going to be an increase in deaths.
Based on my observations about the willingness of politicians and policymakers to panic and to err on the side of draconian measures rather than risk anything.
But they could have done that already.
Yeah, but they still can. Just because they haven't yet doesn't mean they never will.
But it doesn't suggest to you that they're looking at it and going, well, let's see what happens with hospitalisations and deaths.
Yeah, if they're being rational, but they haven't always been rational.
Didn't they do that last year? They were like, let everyone do their shopping, and then right when it's Christmas, they go,
I'll bet you a tenner.
You're locked in.
I'll bet you a tenner.
All right, well, we've got 2 more pods.
I'll bet you a tenner there's no more restrictions than mask wearing.
Right, you got it.
Ooh.
We've got 2 more pods that we're going to do.
It's
this
official.
one and 2 more after this before Pierre swans off to Canada.
Well, it's Christmas anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, some of us are still going to be working.
Really, we do a podcast on the 23rd?
24th's actually a Friday.
24th, yeah.
We're all off then, aren't we? You're away anyway.
Yeah.
You can do it from Canada. Take your camera.
Sure,
over
yeah.
there.
Let's do one on New Year's Eve, on Christmas Eve.
Get some Canadian whiskey. That's actually, we've had all kinds of other whiskey. We need to start getting to Canadian whiskey.
Canadian blend is actually pretty good.
Anyway, so that's that. What other small talk have we got? We got a kind of a bribe of the week.
Mm-hmm.
We went out to dinner with Huawei this week, which was really cool. They went to sort of Mingjian, is it?
I forget, yeah.
Yeah. Really nice, posh Chinese restaurant attached to a hotel in Kensington, right on Hyde Park. And
really good.
And we had loads of courses, didn't we?
Mm-hmm.
I think a highlight was the whole roast duck.
That was
rather
really
than
good.
shredding it, although we did skin it up in pancakes. Rather than shredding it, they just sliced it, which felt a bit posher.
Yeah. Not sure it works. I mean, it tastes good, but I'm not sure it works
It's easier
as well
to skin up
as
when it's shredded.
When you're rolling it like
Exactly.
a cigar, it's better if it's shredded, really.
Yeah, I basically had to do my pancake in about 2 bites.
It's
If you try
kind
to
of.
do it 2 more, you get bits just
Yeah. I was
I was
slobbing
gonna say,
out
it's a
everywhere.
weird food to eat in a corporate setting, like.
It is, yeah.
With
Yeah.
your
Well, do you know
hands.
what? Fair play to Huawei. So the whole thing was just off the record. So we're not going to get into what we discussed, but fair play to Huawei. It was a really chilled night. Everyone was just chatty. There was no agenda.
Yeah.
There was no corporate brainwashing. They just wanted to get some hacks together and just say hello. How's it going?
Was there a speech?
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, actually. It's one of the best.
I don't think it was a speech, was there?
I think
he do a
Victor
little bit at the
Zhang
start?
did a
Victor
little
Zhang,
intro,
little
but
bit.
even that was very, very
No.
downbeat, wasn't it? Not downbeat.
Not
It was
downbeat.
just only lasted a couple of minutes.
Sure,
It
yeah.
wasn't like a pitch or anything. So
I mean, I think, what's going on there as well is just Huawei just going, look, we're still here.
yeah,
We're not going anywhere, son.
yeah.
You can throw all this stuff at us that you want, but we're still here.
Well, and I, as you say, it was all Chatham House rules and off the record, but I'm sure they wouldn't mind me saying this. They did make the point that they're still, because they've said it elsewhere, that they're still obviously a significant presence in Europe. Just because there's been this pushback doesn't mean they don't have huge businesses across the continent still. And the UK is a bit of an unusual case, really, in terms of having gone so hard on restrictions.
No, that's true. Most of continental Europe, I mean, the EU still hasn't adopted a sort of strident position on Chinese vendors, or as we call them, high risk vendors.
Yeah.
There's still plenty of it going on in Germany. They still do business in France, don't they?
They do. Yeah.
Wait, they
At the
should be
moment.
called vendors of concern.
High risk vendors.
No,
That's the
I like-
expression.
Yeah, I know, but he's going
I know,
vendors
I
of
know.
concern. So yeah, and I just went to them. Well, look, if you reminding everyone that you're still around means taking us out for pricey dinners, then count me in. So that counts as a bribe of the week. It doesn't mean that we're going to be nicer or nastier to Huawei than we'll be before. As I always stress, the bribe of the week is a tongue-in-cheek thing.
Yeah.
It's just a nice little perk, and it was nice to meet them. I got chatting to some cool people from Huawei and some other journalists that don't come to some of these things. So it's just a good night out.
Yeah.
Although, so we've got to give a shout out to their head of comms, Paul Harrison. Is that his name?
Yeah.
He medicined us at the end of the night with some sake. And I was, I definitely had a bit of a head on me the next morning. What about you?
I felt absolutely awful. It's the worst hangover I've had in about a year.
Really?
Yeah.
That minging?
Yep. The first half of the day was a write-off. It was just me sitting at the table trying to
Just
think
sort
of what
of
I was going to do that
dabbing
day.
your brow and panting.
I took a load of Nurofen. I was all right in the afternoon.
Yeah. Yeah, those are nasty. You can get, sometimes they can be slow burners. You wake up and you're still a bit pissed, and you're like, I think I've dodged a bullet this time.
Yeah.
You need a
And
pint
then
of water.
It came on at about 10 o'clock.
And then it just starts kicking in properly. and you're like, oh, I hate myself.
Yeah, that wasn't good.
So, never again.
So yeah. But I don't want to dissuade Paul Harrison from, getting the silly drinks out at the end of the night. He knows it makes sense.
It's a funny one, sake, because it doesn't taste that strong, but it's obviously quite potent.
Slip it down, especially when you got posh sake, which I presume we had.
Yeah.
So that's all good. Right, I think that's enough faffing. Do you have any sort of producer stuff you want to throw into the mix? No. Presumably they're still into us in Hampstead or Belsize Park or something. So we will just crack on, actually, because we've got to try and record another little video for a colleague after this. So we're going to move on. What are we going to chat about? Oh, yes, and just to remind you that if you're watching this on site, I nearly missed it.
You're really reversed now.
Yeah, if you're watching this on the site or on Facebook or on YouTube, you can also listen to it on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, and loads of other podcasting platforms. Right, we're going to chat. I think we're going to have to go OpenRAN again. We actually managed to not speak about it last week.
Yeah.
But we're going to have to go back, mainly because Light Reading, your site, did a sort of symposium on the matter.
Digital symposium.
And you wrote up a couple of things.
Yeah, very much with an Asian angle, the stuff that I covered. So it's sort of OpenRAN in Asia.
Yeah, so that's definitely the subset, which is where a lot of the action is.
Yeah, although, I mean, Japan
must be annoying the Americans.
Japan's seen as the kind of hot market, largely because of one company, but actually, I think it's a bit more interesting than that, the story.
Okay, cool. And I journalised a thing where you had China Mobile bigging it up, which again is slightly awkward for the Yanks.
And a bit counterintuitive as well, I think.
Yes, it is. Cool. So we're going to talk about that. Then we're going to talk about the sort of semiconductor sector. A couple of bits of news. I'm going to talk about one I wrote up today, which is the Americans probably putting the kibosh on the NVIDIA acquisition of ARM. And I'm going to say why I've always thought it was a rubbish idea to let NVIDIA buy ARM in the first place. And you've written some stuff about Marvell.
Yeah, and I noticed pre-market trading on the Nasdaq. They're up about 20%, which I think is partly because their results were very good in some areas, but I think some of it's probably related to I'm guessing it's probably related to the NVIDIA ARM decision.
It's up 16% right now.
That's a good point, isn't it? That's a good point.
Because that's one of the. I mean, there's a small group of big ARM, licensees. Is that the right word, licensees? I guess it would be, and it's among them. Oh, look at that.
Yeah, but it's dropping off again, though, isn't it?
It's going to drop off because it went up
16%.
Well, I've realised that with my little bit of stock dabbling over the year, and I'm just doing it on free trade.
Yeah.
And so, firstly, I've got to look at it and realise what's happening. Secondly, there's a delay in the selling. I think they only do a buying and selling phase like once a day, and I don't even have a premium account.
Nah, they wouldn't.
Well, it's not very frequently, I promise you. Maybe you can get a premium account that gets you better.
The fun thing about Marvell is their share price has gone up 330% in the last year and a half.
Wow.
Yeah.
But, when you're... the thing about being a retail investor is if you're up against pros who've got machines that automatically sell off, at a certain moment in time, you're always going to be behind the curve. Yeah. By the time you've realised it's peaked and it's already selling off, by the time you get to sell your shit, it's probably lost half of its value. Anyway. But that's fine. I've never chucked so much money at it that's a deal breaker for me. You'd certainly live and learn. I might do that for my son when he gets a bit older. Just give him a lump sum of money and a free trade account, and just encourage him to muck about, because he could learn a lot of just about
safe stuff. Yeah.
Well, no, just whatever. I mean, just learning about business.
Learning about companies. 0.5% of the.
My son trades in crypto.
Right.
Oh God.
Yeah, I can't have a feeling I've missed
a
boat on that.
But I don't know how much. I don't know how much he's put in of his savings. But
so yeah, we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about why those share price fluctuations might have. Asked me a bit. Share price fluctuations might have happened, and then we're gonna finish off. We're gonna talk about, what was it? Was that Europe thing?
Europe's big tech really is the
we're going to talk about big tech,
whinging about big tech.
Yeah, Europe basically thinks European operators basically think big tech should hand over some cash just cause.
Yeah.
And then we might, if we remember...
And I see Mark Calera at BT's been having a go on Twitter again this week about how much traffic there was on Wednesday night on the BT network. Apparently it's an all-time high because of the football. Right. It was 25 terabits per second sort of peak, which
we'll get into that. I don't understand how they can moan. Anyway, and then we might, if we remember, neither of us wrote it up, but we know there's been the big AWS fest this week.
Yeah.
And there was at least one announcement to do with 5G, which might be worth a nod. Yeah. But I think, speaking only for myself, I didn't write it up just because, we'll go on about our angle on public cloud, which is, is it so smart to hand over control of all your shit to a third party?
Yeah.
but the actual plumbing, the actual sort of under the bonnet of public cloud, I often find goes over my head a little bit. So I basically don't write it up unless I think I can devote sufficient time to really understanding what the hell is going on, and I didn't feel I did this week. So that's why I didn't bother.
Well, I can talk a bit about that.
Cool. All right. So that's what we're going to do. So, yes, to start with, I might as well hand it on to you, because even the only coverage I did of this, I journalised from your story. So why don't you tell us about this sort of like reading OpenRAN event and what you covered?
Yeah, it's like a digital symposium. I think they started doing it when the lockdown happened last year, these online events replacing physical get-togethers, which obviously they couldn't do at the time. It's still a bit difficult now. And they generate quite a lot of interest. I mean, OpenRAN's a hot topic, obviously, anyway. So, but it was led by Gabriel Brown, who's a principal analyst at Heavy Reading, on Tuesday, and then we had another session yesterday, actually, which I haven't really listened back to much of that one yet, which was Simon Stanley, who's another kind of Heavy Reading analyst, more sort of involved on the chip side of things. And the session on Tuesday, I thought was really good. I mean, there were a couple of interesting things that came out of it. There was a presentation by a lady called Dr. Chi Lin I think is how her name's pronounced.
Yeah, surname's just the letter I.
Her surname is just the letter I. I mean, it's this way of sort of transposing Mandarin, I suppose, to...
I guess so, because in Mandarin it's probably some cool hieroglyph.
Yeah,
but in English it's just a vertical line.
Yeah, but she's got quite a grand job title. I think she's a chief scientist or something for China Mobile, and talking a lot about what they've been doing to what their interest is. I think the interesting thing about her is she's not only the chief scientist at China Mobile, she's also got a quite a sort of senior position within the ORAN Alliance, which is the standards group.
Yeah.
That's sort of developing, not really standards group, I should probably say, strictly speaking, specifications group. That's sort of.
We're always getting into that semantical.
Yes, and I still think it should probably be called specifications group.
Well, I'm pleased to see you screw it up occasionally. It's normally me.
But she's got a senior position there on the technical steering committee. I think she's co-chair of that at the moment. Obviously a really smart lady, speaks really good English as well. And the interesting thing is the whole China Mobile involvement in OpenRAN, I think, it's a little bit counterintuitive, yeah? It's not a company that you'd necessarily expect to be that interested in OpenRAN in some ways. Because why? Because the whole OpenRAN story, I think, from a Western perspective, has been fueled by this anti-Huawei kind of campaign that started under Donald Trump. And thank you very much. One of the consequences of that is this sort of protectionist push, I think, in America to try and find alternative vendors to Huawei, and they evidently see OpenRAN as the best way for them to do that. And at the same time, in Europe, you've got where a lot of the big operators are kind of championing OpenRAN and really sort of urging authorities even to get behind it. Their concern is also very much to do with Huawei. It's that if you take Huawei out of the picture, you only have Ericsson and Nokia left as equipment suppliers, and that's not really good enough. We don't want to be in a duopoly. Therefore, we want to get other alternatives into the market.
It's that classic thing that happens with sort of top-down interfering in markets. Mm-hmm. Is you do one thing, and then that creates a problem, so you've got to fix that problem. It's like whack-a-mole, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
And so that's the dilemma we're in now. We don't like the fact we've got a duopoly. I don't think there's any suggestion that Nokia and Ericsson behave in any kind of cartel-like way, in a organised cartel-like way. But when you're a duopoly, it's easy to be a spontaneous cartel.
Yeah.
Because you've only got one competitor to keep an eye on.
Yeah.
If they raise their prices, you've got a choice of not raising yours or just going, fuck it, we might as well have some of this action as well.
Yeah, and if that's the concern, if that is what OpenRAN's all about, and I think from a sort of national press perspective, certainly, then the narrative's very much been to do with, OpenRAN as an alternative to Huawei. Then you look at China Mobile and you sort of think, well, why would they? China's actually become more dependent on Huawei during the over the last couple of years during 5G than it was under 4G. You look at the sort of 4G story. Ericsson and Nokia were bigger suppliers to the Chinese operators in the 4G days and the 3G days than they are in 5G. You've seen what's happened. With
you remember I did the maths. Yeah. I did a little spreadsheet, and basically there was a 700 megahertz tender that China Mobile did.
This is the phase 2 one, isn't it, this year?
Yeah, this is the one in July.
Yeah.
And and the hilarious thing about it, we covered it on the pod at the time, but it's worth reiterating. So the published numbers, they were like three stations, three little sort of subsets of the tender, and there were quite sort of imprecise percentage points on each of those. But then when you applied those percentage points to the numbers and then worked out the total and then worked out the percentages that the grand total came to, they were round numbers, implying it's a completely top-down, predetermined thing. And Huawei got exactly 60%.
Right. And then most of the rest would have gone to ZTE.
Yeah, it was 31%. And then Nokia 4, Datang 3, Ericsson 2.
Exactly. So Nokia basically lost out badly last year, didn't get anything at all, I think, in phase 1 of 5G. Not as a sort of geopolitical thing. I think it was just perceived not to be at the races, really, technologically. Then they had various issues that they've been trying to get on top of. Ericsson managed to increase its share slightly. But after what's happened this year, I don't know the figure you just said is about 2% or something.
Yeah, 2%.
It's right back down. So they're more dependent now on Huawei than they've ever been in China.
Exactly.
And it's not like there seems to be any, at government level, you don't sense perhaps that that's much of a concern. And, they have this.
On the contrary, I think the government's determined.
The government's pushed them to use these suppliers.
If you assume that it's a matter of political priority to the Chinese Communist Party to not let the Yanks kill Huawei, then of course, if whatever power they've got, they're going to mandate. Because if China Mobile's not chucking money at Huawei, then who is?
Yeah,
obviously China Telecom and China Unicom. But if Chinese operators on the whole aren't keeping Huawei afloat, then it's kind of dead, isn't it?
It's completely. So the story's a bit counterintuitive why China Mobile would be interested in OpenRAN. But then on the other hand, if you think about the origins of OpenRAN, you go back to 2018 when it sort of the O-RAN Alliance came into existence. How did it come into existence? So these two smaller groups, one called the XRAN Forum, which was largely a Western thing. I think AT&T was a sort of big sponsor of that. And you had another group called the C-RAN Alliance, and the main backer of the C-RAN Alliance was China Mobile. It's very much a Chinese thing. And those two things came together. This is sort of before the days when Donald Trump was going around saying we need to not be heavily reliant on China. It was almost like a different era,
That's true. That's where the biggest.
Hard to imagine it happening now.
That's where we'd write stories about how Huawei's kicking everyone's ass, basically.
It was, and I think, and also I remember when the O-RAN Alliance made its big announcement at the Mobile World Congress 2018, and it was very much a sort of quirky thing almost. We want there's an opportunity to lower costs, perhaps there's an opportunity for service innovation, maybe we can get some vendors in that can do specialized things that aren't being done, but all this stuff about alternatives to Huawei wasn't really in the narrative. And I think there was probably an element of that. I mean, even then the market's consolidated a lot over the last 20 years, and you go back and people used to say there's 8-10 equipment vendors. People like Nortel, Motorola, Marconi, all these guys were involved to some extent if you go back far enough. And it's basically consolidated. The last big round of consolidation, of course, was Nokia and Alcatel-Lucent. We're now left with these three giants. It's changing a little bit. You've got people like Samsung, obviously, and ZTE in the mix, and some of the Japanese players now, partly because of OpenRAN, actually. But it's still quite a consolidated market. I think 80%, the estimate is still those three big companies, Ericsson, Huawei, Nokia. So there was still an element of that, but that whole story's become a lot more pronounced, obviously, since the kind of anti-Huawei backlash. But I think that the fact that China Mobile was interested, was the main sponsor of this C-RAN Alliance, and it was heavily involved in the group that merged with the XRAN Forum to produce the O-RAN Alliance, shows that it's always had skin in the game. Yeah, it's always had, and I think a lot of it is to do with. If you look at what China does when it gets involved in a new technology, what it's done with 5G, it's explored all these various use cases, hasn't it? You look at the experimentation there's been with use cases in China. It's probably a more vibrant, diverse market in terms of the things they've been trying to do with 5G and IoT than you've had in the West. Huge amounts of experimentation, to the extent I think where they've said recently, actually some of these use cases aren't going to go anywhere, and we're going to shut down some of these trials.
Yeah, and I think the national strategy, it's so easy for us to caricature China because it's positioned as this new great global antagonist.
Yeah,
and the leader, he does cut a slightly sort of Machiavellian figure at times.
For sure. Yeah.
But, they're really serious about technology leadership. Whatever legacy stuff, accusations might have been thrown at them 10 or 20 years ago about, IP theft and that sort of thing. Fact is, they've got world-class universities. They've got millions of people swatting their asses off learning this stuff.
Yeah.
And they genuinely want to be a global leader in technology. And so it stands to reason that they're going to try and foster a sort of, for want of a better term, Silicon Valley kind of fail fast, try shit out, throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks type of approach.
Yeah, and I think one of the things actually that we heard mentioned by BT, when we had that little roundtable with them about OpenRAN was small cells, wasn't it? That was one of the things they called out that could be an interesting
could be handy in an
opportunity.
OpenRAN context.
Small cells is a really big, as I understand it from talking to people who know the market. Small cells is a really big thing in China. The big operators are very interested in the small cell opportunity, which is basically building like hotspots, I guess, really, where you have a base station that would only cover a small area, but it's might be an area in a shopping centre, for example.
As we know, I mean, they're particularly handy in terms of 5G, not necessarily because of 5G itself, but because 5G is using shorter wavelengths frequency, which has inferior propagation characteristics. It needs a bit of help from a small cell,
completely
getting from the base station inside a building.
Yeah,
I'll tell you one thing, just a quick tangent. I wasn't planning to talk about it, but I'll only mention it briefly. One story I wrote up this week that a lot of people seem to overlook. Ofcom put this consultation paper out on terahertz spectrum.
Right.
So millimeter wave goes up to about 100 gigahertz, I think, the broad band. And then from 100 gigahertz all the way to 3 terahertz, you've got terahertz band. So that's obviously...
That really is a sitting on the base station thing to get it to work.
Quite, but they said let's have a butcher's at it.
Okay. Well, who knows? By the time they start using that, maybe propagation's been improved. I mean, people have been talking recently, haven't they, about how millimeter wave might be more useful than it seems so far. Because
and maybe back to the reason it's relevant, back to your small cell thing. Maybe if small cells are sufficiently numerous by that stage, then they can boost even more rubbish frequency like terahertz.
But it's new because it's a new deployment. It's like a greenfield thing. Yeah, you're rolling out these sites. They're new. They're kind of filling gaps. It's not like one of the big issues with OpenRAN is, we have to sort of tear out existing equipment or make sure it works with legacy technologies and all this. So you've got all those worries that go along with that.
And an extra cost.
So if you're using it for small cells, it's like and it's very specialised as well. So it's a way of perhaps getting new vendors in to do. So the interesting company I spoke with this week actually on the chip side is a company called Picocom, which is part Chinese, part British. Strangely enough, I mean,
so that's still allowed.
It's geopolitically kind of interesting organisation, but they're developing,
a bit like our dinner.
And they're developing silicon for small cells, OpenRAN compatible like chips, the sort of thing that would basically be used instead of an x86 to do baseband processing, but very much tailored to a small cell market. And I was chatting to the guy who's president, Peter Claydon, he's called. Well, you're going to be going up against people like Marvell and Xilinx and these big guns who've got, and it's basically a startup essentially, this company. And one of the things he was saying is it's the requirements for a macro cell and a small cell are very, very different. You'd need, you're not doing all that sort of 64 antenna processing stuff in a small cell. It might just be 2 or 4 or maybe 8, and therefore the silicon requirements are quite different. So this is why I think one of the reasons why I think the Chinese are interested in OpenRAN.
Okay.
And I actually think another reason is, we operators here worry about being overly reliant on Ericsson and Nokia.
Yeah.
Just because of what the government's saying. I think if you're a technology person working for China Mobile at the moment and you're building a network and trying to make money out of it, and trying to ensure that it works properly and it's resilient, it's not necessarily a great thing that network is now so heavily reliant on Huawei.
Yeah.
Now, they're not going to use Ericsson and Nokia for geopolitical reasons, but if they can cultivate an equipment market within China of companies that are specifically developing OpenRAN products, like Picocom, for instance, and maybe bigger ones than that, maybe software companies that we don't know about, then that provides them with an alternative to this one big company that, to be quite honest, has got a lot of problems at the moment because of US sanctions. There's all these question marks about its future. And, I'm not saying it's going to collapse and fail, but certainly some of the sanctions have made it very difficult for Huawei to get hold of components in a way that, those restrictions don't affect other companies.
Yeah, and I don't think China's interested in going 100% protectionist.
No.
I mean, they could close down. They could be like the China of 50 years ago and be largely closed to the rest of the world and obviously do just fine in terms of telecoms because they got Huawei and ZTE and all that sort of thing. But I just don't think that's what China wants to do. I think China wants to continue to be part of the global thing. Yeah, you could say, like some chats I had, I won't name who it was and what specifically we chatted about, but the other night I was just interested to know about some other perspectives on the great game.
Yep.
And everyone knows that China announced this Belt and Road Initiative quite a while ago, and I think the West feels like it was slow to react to it. And China probably does have some economically imperialist ambitions, but from China's point of view, they're like, well, why the fuck shouldn't we? That's what the West's been doing all this time.
Yeah, completely.
So why can't we have a go?
Yeah.
So I'm sympathetic to that. Obviously, as soon as it starts messing with my stuff, I become less sympathetic to it. But on paper, I mean, you could even argue that, every now and then people get in a flap about nuclear proliferation, like Iran or something like that. And I don't like the thought of Iran having nukes because they've got some pretty crazy shit going on there. But how come Pakistan can have it, or Israel can have it, or we can have it, and they can't? There's no hard and fast reason. I mean, I understand interest. So the same goes with this economic stuff. And so now we're sort of reacting to it, and I think China just wants to win at globalization.
Uh-huh.
And I think in a lot of the ways it wants to win at globalization is through legitimate means, by just offering better stuff than everyone else. And then I think there are times it tries to put its thumb on the scales through things like currency manipulation and other bits of protectionism.
Yeah.
But again, we're no longer in the EU, as I continue to celebrate, especially with Ursula von der Leyen going, she's thinking of making vaccines mandatory within the EU. I'm like, we'll see you later. But the EU's plenty protectionist, everyone's plenty protectionist. So I just think, my feeling is I just find all these accusations of, China's cheating and we're not, should be disingenuous.
Yeah.
And anyway, that's my roundabout way of saying, back to your point about them not just being happy, retreating into themselves and relying on Huawei. And they must know that if Huawei's got a guaranteed 60% of the RAN market forever, that's going to provide a disincentive to stay lean and mean and innovate. I don't care what Huawei says, that's just the law of economics.
Yeah.
Unless you have to strive and compete, you're going to get a bit sort of fat around the middle, aren't you?
Yeah, and I think China Mobile, I mean, to your point about China wanting to play in, a globalized market and seeing opportunities there, I think that's possibly another reason why there's this Chinese involvement in OpenRAN.
Yeah.
I mean, some people would see that, some people that we know and talk to on the analyst side would probably see that as a sinister thing. The fact the OpenRAN Alliance, ORAN Alliance, most of the companies in it, I think, or the country that's best represented in terms of contributors and members is the US. But number two is China. I think it's more than 40 companies are involved. So all three of the big Chinese operators.
And loads of IP is going to come from Huawei and ZTE.
Well, Huawei's not. This is the interesting thing. Huawei's not a member of the ORAN Alliance. But
some of the
ZTE
underlying technologies, it's surely got to have some involvement in.
So this is the thing. Huawei comes out with this line that it's not interested in OpenRAN and it doesn't see the case for it at all and it thinks it's inferior, and they pretty much write it off and seem to suggest that it's never going to go anywhere almost. I mean, they're far more resistant than Ericsson and Nokia.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Nokia's been, out of the big three vendors, Nokia's been the most receptive to it. And we can talk about that in a minute, actually. But And then Ericsson sort of somewhere in the middle, and Huawei, obviously the one that's least enthusiastic to the extent where it's not even a member. I know there are people who will say that China Mobile is possibly feeding information to Huawei. Or, China Mobile is Huawei's biggest customer.
Yeah, as we just said, that's 60%, I think.
And also there's all these smaller little companies that we don't really know much about. I mean, Pico.com is a member, and it's as I say, it's part British, part Chinese, so it's a little bit easier to get in touch with them and have a chat. But there's a lot of very obscure companies where we don't really know what the ownership structure is and who's behind them, and possibly Huawei has something to do with them. And I find it quite hard to believe that Huawei would just go no and turn around and pretend that it's never going to happen, because
especially not when its biggest customer's quite keen on it.
Exactly. Why would you do that? So, but I can see, so there's all sorts of reasons why I can see China Mobile being interested. And the other thing I would say is that if they do something on OpenRAN, you talk about trying to build scale for OpenRAN and actually get some momentum behind it and get prices down and scale for it. even if they did a small cells deployment in just a bit of China, it's such a vast market that it could be the equivalent of sort of macro deployment in another country. So it's the sort of thing that could actually drive a lot of interest, in the investment community, the Chinese investment community I'm talking about, and help to cultivate this sort of Chinese ecosystem for equipment. And then all of a sudden they've got not only alternative suppliers potentially coming up in China in the same way that the US wants those kinds of companies, but they've also got a base potentially to sell to other markets, as long as they don't get banned from doing that. But there's plenty of places that might want to still buy from the Chinese, Africa, other parts of Asia.
Most of Africa and non-Anglo APAC is still not hostile to China, to the best of my knowledge.
Yeah.
You could argue they've still got round about a third to half of the world to play with. So that's another thing to bear in mind. While fair play to Huawei for staying strong in the UK and that manifesting itself through nice dinners for us. They're outside of China. Their financial future lies in sort of APAC and EMEA. Africa and Middle East.
And I suppose that's the concern, because there's been a lot of this stuff up from the Europe. I mean, we're going to talk about one of their other gripes later on, the European operators sort of having a whinge at Europe. But one of the things they've been coming out with in the last few weeks has been this kind of leaning on European authorities to back OpenRAN more, fund trials, provide funding for startups. And the argument is that if you don't do that, then they'll lose out when it comes to it's all going to be dominated by US and Asian companies, And we haven't seen many Chinese companies, actually, even though there's this huge membership list that's Chinese in the ORAN Alliance. You don't see a lot of Chinese suppliers of OpenRAN software or hardware turning up in trials and deployments. And stuff.
Well,
there's the geopolitics, I know, but Africa, as you just said, Africa, other parts of Asia, South America, there's lots of other places where they could be active.
But is it worth moving on to the sort of second thing that you derived from?
Yeah, so the one thing that I focused on was China, and another one was Japan, because there was another presentation from NTT Docomo, which is Japan's biggest operator. And whenever you hear about OpenRAN, one of the first names that comes up is Rakuten, which is Japanese, kind of the equivalent of Amazon, but a lot smaller. It's sort of the Japanese,
but it's also Amazon. A greenfield mobile operator.
It's an internet company. It's an e-commerce, TV business.
Yeah,
fintech.
Somewhere between sort of Amazon and I don't know, Netflix or something.
But they also, the reason that we talk about them a lot and why they're so well known now outside China and in telecom circles is because they've got this really big project to build a fourth mobile network in Japan using OpenRAN and a bunch of other kind of newfangled technologies. And
that's their big thing, is because we're greenfield, we don't have to worry about any legacy shit. We can go straight in on the cutting edge.
Yeah, and they're generally regarded, I think whenever you get into a discussion with anybody about OpenRAN, they're kind of seen as the big cheerleader for OpenRAN and the only example of a company in a developed market that's actually rolled it out at scale. At least I thought so, until our digital symposium this week, because NTT Docomo, I didn't know. And it seems that other people, I talked to Gabe a little bit about it afterwards, and he was a bit taken aback as well. But what they seem to be saying is that their whole 5G deployment so far, which by the way is about 10,000 base stations now, so it's a pretty significant amount they've rolled out. If you think about the UK being a market where someone like BT would have 20,000 sites altogether, a 10,000 base station deployment in Japan is pretty substantial.
Yep.
It's all based on OpenRAN principles. So the guy who did the presentation was saying all the radio units they buy are different vendors from the baseband stuff, the compute stuff, which is the big thing. This is like that was always kind of one of the sort of most important things for people who were very keen on OpenRAN, was to have that decoupling between those two elements, really. So you don't have to buy those things together. You get an interface between them that's more open, and it allows you to, say, buy Samsung baseband equipment and use it with Nokia radios, for instance. And what seems to be happening to some extent, there's a few vendors involved, but certainly Nokia is providing a lot of the baseband stuff with radios from Fujitsu. Which is also really interesting as well, because Nokia's been, as I say, they're one of the companies that out of the big three equipment vendors, they've always been the most sort of enthusiastic about, or said they're enthusiastic
paid the most
about
lip service to it.
OpenRAN, and they've kind of taken a bit of flack. People not sort of believing the story. It is just lip service.
No, because it's worth. We've done it loads of times, but it's worth recapping. Obviously, where people like Ericsson and Nokia make a lot of money is if you want a base station, you got to get the whole shebang off them, and I'm sure. And so it's all fully integrated, but they've got guaranteed business for the antenna, for the baseband, for the software, for the SI stuff, all that sort of thing, and that is presumably a lot more profitable than just selling bits and bobs.
Yeah.
So obviously the OpenRAN paradigm is threatening to the business model.
Yeah.
And so we've always found it a bit funny for them to come out and go, "No, we love it." We're like, "Really?"
Yeah.
It'd be like if we suddenly came out and went, we're really big fans of this other telecoms podcast. Everyone would be like, "Oh, you fuck."
Yeah.
Because no, people say they like competition, but no one really does.
I know. Yeah.
So, but then again, we also consider.
But they don't want to be a Kodak.
They don't want to be a Kodak, and they don't, and they've got that, as we've said before, they've got this delicate balancing act, which is again back to the original thing we were talking about with Huawei. Why it's slightly surprising that Huawei's being quite as surly about it as they are, because they can't be seen to be hostile to the interests of their big customers.
Totally. Yeah. And that's how Nokia's actually specifically presented it. I think if you talk to I think I asked the CEO even on one of the investor calls about it, or he got asked about it by someone, if it wasn't me, and basically we can't. We can't. Yeah, that's what he said. We can't just go. We don't want to do OpenRAN.
Yeah.
Because that's what customers are asking for, and therefore, if you're going to do it, you want to do it well. Yeah, you want to be one of the best OpenRAN companies there is.
So we might as well get stuck in.
And my impression is, I've checked this with people, and they didn't want to comment themselves, but I've got it from sort of reliable sources that they are providing baseband stuff in Japan that works with these Fujitsu radios. And
I didn't even know Fujitsu was big into radios.
Fujitsu and NEC are the two. So Fujitsu is supplying stuff for Dish in America.
NEC's on a bit of a tear.
NEC's on a tear. Fujitsu's the other one in Japan that's kind of like that. He liked that on a tear thing.
On a tear. Was that an inadvertent pun?
No, that's like we talked about this earlier.
Oh right, yeah. We were just chatting for another thing. We were just chatting to someone from Netcracker, which is owned by NEC.
Yeah.
And they won 2 awards this year in the awards, so they're doing well.
Yeah. So I think this is good. It's a good story for Nokia. It's almost refutes some of this criticism that they've had that they're just paying lip service to it. That they're saying they've got OpenRAN compatible stuff, but they don't actually. You've got this situation in Japan with NTT Docomo. It seems has the biggest OpenRAN 5G deployment in the world. But this is the other thing about Rakuten. Most of Rakuten's stuff's not 5G. In March, they've got 30,000 sites now deployed, but most of those are 4G. By March this year, they've not provided a recent update, but when they last provided an update on the 5G side of things in March, only 1,000 of those were 5G sites. And the other thing is that all the 4G stuff isn't compatible with ORAN Alliance specs. They might have opened the interfaces and done and allowed different equipment to work with this rival company's products, but it's not ORAN Alliance compatible, so it's not really OpenRAN,
And yet you've got, at risk of referring to the Glotel Awards one more time, another company that is Rakuten / Altiostar.
Yeah.
And that was all OpenRAN stuff that our judges were big on.
Yeah.
So on the whole,
well, it depends what you mean by OpenRAN.
I suppose so.
But OpenRAN is just the idea of having a network that allows you to use one person's stuff with another person's stuff because you've opened the interfaces between them. But ultimately, you're going to have a proper sort of ecosystem based on that, and it's going to become a global standard. It has to be based on something that's been agreed within a specifications body.
Yeah.
Because there's always been a possibility for Nokia to say, well, we're going to work with this radio company and we'll open our technology so that we can work with them. In fact, that used to happen in NTT Docomo's case in the 4G days. They've done that before. But to have it actually based on the specs points to a future where you don't have to go through all these heavy sort of plug and heavy testing sessions because you just know out of the box that it's going to work. That's the dream, really.
Certainly is. I'm old enough to remember PCs when when you couldn't be so sure that a new thing that even a peripheral would work with the fucking thing. You'd have
Completely.
to go off and find a driver and all that sort of thing. Bit before your time, Pierre.
So in Rakuten's case, the whole 4G project they've done is it's open in the sense that in fact they're using Nokia as well. They're using Nokia hardware with Altiostar software, for instance. But they themselves have acknowledged that that wasn't based on ORAN Alliance specifications. It's just something they did because they wanted to get it going. Get on with it, exactly. So they moved ahead of where the specifications
that's another
was
danger,
up to,
isn't
really.
it? While it's not, we sort of really agonised over what the status is of things like the ORAN Alliance versus things like 3GPP.
Yeah.
And and then they're not a specifications body. Is that right? I forgot that. I always get the semantics wrong.
3GPP is a proper standards group.
Standards, that's it.
Yeah.
So 3G standards group, the ORAN Alliance isn't. It's just forming specifications. And
it
the
likes to think
semantical
of itself
difference
as a standards body.
Yeah.
But
semantical difference is presumably there's all sorts of like rigor and best practice.
That's more
and
of
all that sort of
of an oversight thing in terms of meeting WTO, I think, requirements.
I see.
I mean, that I think that's more interesting on the geopolitical side of things because if you have proper accountability and certain companies don't have control, then everything's very transparent. It becomes easier to be involved in a group like that, even though you might be working alongside someone like Huawei, which is why actually American companies have been allowed to continue their involvement in the 3GPP alongside Huawei. Because if they didn't, then they'd be sort of screwing themselves in a way, because that's the globally accepted standard.
Exactly, and yet there was, as if to illustrate that, there was that flap about the ORAN Alliance with Nokia a few months ago.
Yeah, and the difference with the ORAN Alliance is that it doesn't meet WTO.
There we go.
It doesn't appear to meet WTO criteria.
It's not quite the sort of gold standard.
And they think that they've addressed that by making some changes in terms of transparency, but they still have this situation where 5 big companies have veto rights. One of which is China Mobile, actually. I mean, this is slightly off the topic of what's going on in Japan. But
well, anyway, yeah. So back to the Japan thing. Basically, what I'm getting from it, and from what you've just described, is that Japan's kind of kicking ass on OpenRAN. Is that how you view it?
Yeah, I mean, they're kicking us not only in terms of having like 2 massive. I mean, I don't know much about KDDI and SoftBank either. Let's remember there are 2 other networks there, and I suspect.
SoftBank's too busy trying to flog on
I don't know about SoftBank, but certainly KDDI I think is also quite involved in what's going on in OpenRAN. But in the case of, based on this NTT Docomo presentation, it's got a bigger 5G OpenRAN deployment than Rakuten has at the moment. And then Rakuten's obviously very highly regarded in terms of being involved in the technology and owning some of the companies that are developing OpenRAN products. And then you have all these vendors that are associated with this, like, as you just mentioned, NEC, Fujitsu. Altiostar itself is American, but it's owned by Rakuten, so you could almost say that's it's kind of a Japanese-American firm.
As our
now,
awards
isn't it?
show, that they're very sort of, both all the entries that came in from one were linked to the other.
Yeah.
So they're obviously very closely attached.
And the whole thing is. I mean, I don't know how much this bit is quite an interesting story. It's almost like the reinvigoration of Japan as a kind of supplier to the mobile equipment business, and it's all happened. It all seems to have happened quite recently. You look at NEC and what it's managed to do in the last 2-3 years. Not only a big deal with Rakuten in Japan, but they're also heavily involved with companies like Telefonica now, for instance. Fujitsu is doing stuff with Dish. Another thing that came out of the digital symposium was a presentation by Enrique Blanco, who's the CTO at Telefonica, and he's saying that their kind of RAN software partner of choice is Altiostar. So you've got all these companies that have got this connection to Japan, and it's just worked in a really curious way. And as I say, I don't know how much government interest there's been, whether there was some kind of centrally directed plan to try and reinvigorate the sector and take advantage of OpenRAN to do this.
NEC, I mean, it could have just been my own ignorance of the matter. I always thought of NEC as a very old school, sort of stuffy industrial, but they're actually pretty cutting edge these days. Yeah,
and I think because they're in so many different markets, we didn't perhaps pay as much attention to them as we should have done on the radio side of things.
They've got that Japanese model of just getting involved in everything.
Yeah, and Fujitsu is similar.
I forget.
Jack of all trades.
No, but I think there's a proper Japanese name for these big conglomerates.
Right.
Like there's a Korean name, which I think is like Chable Cable,
right?
Like that.
Yes,
and there's a Japanese equivalent. Just Mitsubishi, Sony, Fujitsu. They've got a bit of everything, haven't they?
Yeah, and I don't know. I don't know what the. Yeah, I mean they've always been there in the equipment market, NEC and Fujitsu. It's not like they haven't been doing radio products before, but they've managed to sort of almost revitalise their business through OpenRAN and with the support of Rakuten. I mean, Rakuten doesn't have any obvious financial stake in NEC that's disclosed, but they certainly seem to have quite an odd relationship with them in a way that you wouldn't with you wouldn't see that sort of thing happening. I don't think with someone like BT and Nokia to the same extent.
So you're an operator and vendor sort of close.
Yeah, I mean, I've been
like
on
a close R&D partnership sort of
totally.
thing.
I mean, I've been on conference calls with the Tariq Amin before. He's the CTO of Rakuten Mobile, and he's the guy who's really responsible for the whole thing. The network rollout, and he said that they basically went to NEC and said, "This is what what we want you to do for us, and this is how much we're prepared to pay, and this is the EBITDA margin that we'll accept that you make from doing this." It's almost like setting out. It's a very odd way of doing things in a way. It's quite unusual, quite unorthodox.
It doesn't feel like a negotiation, does it?
No, and it's almost like using NEC as a kind of R&D house, almost like using it like an in-house development.
Well, again,
facility.
culturally, I mean, I've never been to Japan. I'd love to. The sort of food, culture, history, all that stuff. I really dig it.
Yeah,
but it could be that culturally, what seems a little bit odd to us is a lot more normal there.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, we better move that on.
About that for a long time.
Well, just because we want to get done in about half an hour, we've got a couple more things to do. But one thing I'll say, just to sort of wrap up that sort of general focus on how East Asia seems to be where all the OpenRAN stuff's happening, is that's a bit awkward for the Americans, I would say, because they put a lot of political capital in OpenRAN as being some kind of panacea for their own mobile sector, but even the American companies that are doing well, like Altiostar, are owned by Japanese.
Well, America does. I mean, the trouble with America is, I think that there seems to be this political view that they could build it was almost at odds with what OpenRAN's all about, actually, because OpenRAN's all about fragmented market and having small specialist firms.
Own the open thing.
And they seem to think that they could produce a rival to Huawei through OpenRAN. Well, that's not what OpenRAN is.
Point of it. Yeah.
And they do have companies, people like Mavenir and Parallel Wireless, which is very prominent, and JMA Wireless is another one. They're software companies that do OpenRAN, stuff.
By the way, I'm hoping we're going to get Mavenir bloke on early next year.
Well, that'd be great. Yeah. But so they do have, and they've also got the chip designers as well. That's the important thing, I think, about the Americans.
Yes.
In a way that nobody else really does.
There's a segue for you.
Yeah.
Nice one. So you've obviously been doing this for a while, Ian. So talking about chips.
Yeah.
We've got one. I'm going to start by talking about my one, which is the proposed NVIDIA acquisition of ARM.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this actually was proposed about a year ago, I think. Let me just click through and see what my hyperlink says.
Seems even longer than that.
Yeah, it does feel like we've been going on about it for a while. Let me see. Yeah, so no, more than that. 14th of September. And my headline, as soon as it was announced, was NVIDIA will struggle to get regulatory approval for its $40 billion acquisition of ARM. $40 billion.
And you were right.
Yeah, and look, I'm not going to claim any great credit because it's bloody obvious why.
Yeah.
But I'll summarise it now. So ARM is almost unique as a company in that, as again, this is another area we get into sort of slight semantical quicksand. But ARM licenses designs for semiconductors made on the ARM microarchitecture. And ARM microarchitecture, original ARM used to be an acronym, and now they've decided to go lowercase for some annoying reason. And it stood for Advanced RISC Machines, I think.
Yeah.
And RISC itself is a abbreviation, which is Reduced Instruction Set Computing.
Which is what Picocom's using, actually.
There we go.
RISC-V, yeah.
So, and the Reduced Instruction Set Computing kind of does what it says on the tin. It's basically a simpler sort of boffin language to tell bits of silicon what to do.
Yeah.
Which is why the ARM architecture has always been superior to the other main microarchitecture that we have in chips in the world, which is x86, which is the Intel one that AMD also uses. because it's just intrinsically more energy efficient. Now, the reason it hasn't completely outcompeted Intel is because there are plenty of environments where energy efficiency isn't the highest priority, and you just want like raw computing power and all that sort of thing. And also things like PCs. You know, we're all right. I've got a Dell PC that'll have an Intel thing in it. Look, I've even got my little Intel Core i5 inside, and I hardly ever even hear it doing that sort of hairdryer impression. So it obviously doesn't overheat. Granted, all I'm doing is writing stories. I'm not like, you know, I'm not transcoding video. I don't know how your Mac deals with it, but then you wouldn't admit it even if it did struggle because you're so partisan. So yes, but certainly for mobile phones, for any kind of embedded environment, it's superior, and it's starting to make headway even in things like data centers, where even though you're not constrained by space, you know, cooling is a massive consideration in environments like that. And so Arm's pretty much the only one who does this model of licensing the designs, and then it licenses them to NVIDIA for starters, licenses to Qualcomm, licenses them to, you know, that's the only reason why smartphone makers have started being able to make their own chips. Less so Samsung, because Samsung's got a whole semiconductor thing, as we just discussed earlier. It's got its fingers in loads of pies. But the reason Apple was able to start making these chips, which by all accounts are as good as anything out there, is because it can license the designs from ARM. It couldn't reinvent the wheel. It couldn't make its own Apple instruction set. That's asking too much. But most of the heavy lifting's already done by licensing these ARM things. So whoever controls ARM basically has a hell of a lot of control over the global chip world. Global world doesn't really apply. Global chip ecosystem. There we are, to use a slightly more wanky term. And you know, ARM used to be a standalone UK company. I've been to ARM Towers over in Cambridge. It's literally next to a field. You can leave the office and then there's like some cows next door.
It looks quite swanky these days, that office.
Yeah, some bits of it. You know, maybe I didn't get the swankiest bit.
I think they've done it up.
I actually went there and interviewed the first gig I did for 7.5 years ago when I started this, when we were still doing magazines. I interviewed Simon Segars, who's the CEO.
Right. Yeah.
And anyway, yeah, and I've always been proud of them. You know, I'm not massively nationalistic, but it's nice to see a UK company that's a world-class player in technology. We don't have that many. So I'm like, good for them. And, you know, you've got all that Cambridge tech scene, although they're not part of Silicon Fen, as they call it. It's a different part of Cambridge. And they're not affiliated to Cambridge University at all. And then they got bought by SoftBank, and it's like, you know, everyone always gets that slightly protectionist thing. It's like, oh, we're selling the family silver, or whatever.
Well, I think even more so now than when it happened. Perhaps now it wouldn't have happened.
Maybe we're even more protectionist. But, you know, like Kraft buys Cadbury and everyone freaks out. And, you know, in practice, who cares as long as the chocolate still tastes nice? But there we go.
Yeah. Well, the irony is that you know, the UK government's all about OpenRAN as well, isn't it, and diversification.
Well, there is that,
and actually, ARM's heavily involved in the OpenRAN debate.
Yes. Well, it would be. I mean,
because as you say, for that, it's the only alternative to having a sort of x86 based server system. So when
SoftBank bought ARM, I was like, all right, fair enough. You know, SoftBank's another of these Japanese conglomerates that's mainly known as being an operator, but latterly has become more of a venture capitalist. It's got this massive vision fund, doesn't it? It just chucks billions of dollars around everywhere. But what SoftBank doesn't do is make chips. It's not involved in the semiconductor world at all. So there wasn't an obvious conflict of interest when SoftBank bought it. The reason for it buying it wasn't that obvious. I've got to say that there was some wittering about IoT.
Yeah, it was one of those. It was one of those. It's a bit like Ericsson's Vonage acquisition, I thought. You know, ones that are hard to explain to people in a couple of sentences. You've always got to wonder if they're going to work out.
And then lo and behold, less than 5 years later, they're ready to flog it.
We don't have antennas. Let's buy an antenna business because we want to sell stuff that involves antennas. It's quite sensible.
That I can get my head
when you've got
around.
to start going, it's got something to do with IoT and we can use the technology to do this, it all gets a bit
spurious. I think in hindsight, it was just because this guy, what's he called?
Masayoshi Son. The reason is because he basically just spends money on anything he can.
Yeah, he's just basically a massive corporate gambler. He's like he's in fucking Vegas every day, that bloke.
If he was in Vegas, he'd be the guy sort of running around all the one-armed
high roller.
and be spending.
He'd be the high roller.
He'd be on the tables.
He'd be like some ad for aftershave with all the beautiful people crowding around him while he rolls the dice
at 4 a.m, looking like really depressed because it had all gone wrong.
With his bow tie undone, hanging around his neck, and he's just like, chucking his last chip at the bloke running the lift, or something like that. Anyway, we've run with that metaphor enough. So he bought it for a laugh, and then he got bored of it, and Nvidia fancied buying it. But the difference is Nvidia is a chip designer. So to get into the semantics, ARM designs the underlying, or licenses the underlying designs to actual chip designers like Nvidia or Qualcomm or Apple, who then send it off largely to TSMC to manufacture it. And if Nvidia controls...
They had some of their secret sauce, as they always say.
Oh, yeah.
That's how it always gets pitched, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, they put some of their secret sauce on top of it, and then they send it off to...
Which is starting to sound fucking obscene, if you ask me. Keep your secret sauce to yourself, you dirty bastard. But Nvidia... Nvidia competes directly with certain companies. I can't name exactly where it competes with Qualcomm or it competes with whoever, or it's probably more. Well, in fact, I'll get into the FTC thing. So, getting back to the point, those are the reasons why it was always a bad idea for it to happen. And the FTC, which is the American Federal Trade Commission, which is their main sort of commercial regulator, has been looking at it almost ever since, and has finally come out and gone, no, this is bullshit. And being Americans, they can't just block it; they got to sue to block it.
Yeah,
and so yeah, that's what they said. And let me just quote the FTC Bureau Competition Director Holly Vedova. She goes, "The FTC is suing to block the largest semiconductor chip merger in history to prevent a chip conglomerate from stifling the innovation pipeline for next generation technologies. Tomorrow's technologies depend on preserving today's competitive cutting edge chip markets." And then, just more generic stuff about distorting markets and incentives. But the interesting thing is then they listed the 3 specific markets that they thought would be distorted if this was allowed to happen. So one is high-level driver assistance systems for passenger cars. So that's like ADAS, is it? Yeah, ADAS, that is the acronym. So basically, chips and software and computer systems for cars, so Teslas and that kind of shit. One is DPU smart NICs, which it says are advanced networking products used to increase security and efficiency of data center servers.
Yeah.
And then lastly, ARM-based CPUs for cloud computing service providers. So again, this is like a data center thing, but they are like NVIDIA. We were talking about other people's share price. In fact, we'll get on to Marvell in a sec, let's not forget. But NVIDIA's share price gone through the roof in the last few years. And one of the reasons is it's got into these ARM-based CPUs for cloud computing. It first got into the data center stuff because its core business is graphics processing. Graphics processing is about parallel processing. It's basically very high grunt. Not necessarily efficient, but incredibly high output. So it's good for, I don't know, Bitcoin mining or other really sort of compute-intensive stuff.
Yeah.
So AI in data centers was a big thing that NVIDIA's built on. And then it's made these ARM-based CPUs for cloud computing.
Well, they've missed one as well there because it's a massive issue in the RAN industry as well.
Well, there we go.
Because those ARM licensees sell base station silicon to people like Nokia, for instance. So you have companies. Marvell is one of them. NVIDIA is one of them. Xilinx is another.
Yeah.
Broadcom, Qualcomm. Those are all companies that develop some kind of have some kind of interest in developing base station chips, and basically Marvell's a company I wrote about today, we keep teasing it. We'll get onto that in a sec. I mean, sorry, you carry on. I'll not go on and on. I was just going to say, but they'd obviously be worried by a takeover like that, or you'd expect them to be worried because it's almost like NVIDIA could go, well, hang on a minute, we're going to decide in the future that we own ARM now, and you're not going to be able to get hold of their of their blueprints.
I think it's as simple as no chip company should ever be allowed to buy ARM.
Yeah.
End of.
Totally.
It's not that complicated. It's taken these people months on end to come to that extremely simple conclusion. But because maybe it took them a while to understand ARM's business model, because it is quite novel. Yeah. It took me a little while. It just happened to be something I was into even before I started this job. So yeah, that's a no-brainer as far as I'm concerned.
I was going to say that I think the whole move itself. I don't know the name of the Nvidia CEO.
Jensen Huang.
Yeah. I think it was a really stupid deal, personally.
Yeah, apparently they've got to pay SoftBank 1.5 bill as a sorry about that.
Yeah, I think he's presumably a bright guy, right?
Very much so.
And because you don't get to run a company like Nvidia unless you're a bright guy. So for a clever bloke,
Yeah,
and he's a founder, right?
He is Nvidia.
So for a clever bloke, it was an incredibly stupid move.
Well, I think he's another.
He should have foreseen what
gambler.
was going to happen here.
I think him and Masayoshi Son, was it?
Masayoshi Son.
Masayoshi Son. They're probably in rival craps tables trying to beat each other.
That's a really bad gamble. That's.
I think so.
That's like betting on Blackburn Rovers to get promoted and win the Premier League next season. It's
felt like a long shot from the start.
It's just not going to happen. This deal's dead in the water after this, because it's not only. It's not. Look, regulators are getting a lot more involved in what goes. Another thing we've seen, I think, in the last few days was that move by the UK's own competition authority to block that Facebook takeover of Giphy. Yeah. And it only takes one authority in one part of the world to say this is something that can't happen for it to put a massive spanner in the works. Yeah,
that's
you've got to get
globalisation
sign-offs from all these different regulatory authorities.
And all one's got to do is go, nah.
All one's got, and this is a substantial one, the FTC, obviously. I don't know what the position actually is in the UK. What has the competition? Because they've been looking at this for a long time and have raised concerns.
They're still on it.
Why it takes that long to be on it, I do not know. What these people are doing, it's pretty obvious it shouldn't happen to anybody.
Lunches.
Yeah. It's just a stupid move. It's just be a stupid thing to allow it to happen.
Yeah.
And it was a stupid deal to be offered in the first place.
Shall I tell you the gutting thing for SoftBank and Son if it doesn't happen?
What's he going to do with it? That's the question.
Well, yeah, but I think there was a speculative piece I saw talking about IPOing, but the amount of money you get from IPOing versus what you get from Nvidia. Because the gutting thing is, compared to when the deal was announced, Nvidia's share price has shot the fuck up since then. So it was a 40 bill acquisition back then, but because a lot of the acquisitions presumably in a specified amount of Nvidia equity, it's now a 75 million deal. So old, I keep forgetting his first name.
Son.
Masayoshi. Yeah. I keep wanting to say it shorter.
But
Masayoshi Son sitting there thinking, great, that's 35 bill.
Just call him
Massa,
because I think that's how people refer to him. Yeah.
So yes, but I agree with you. The US going so far as to sort of aggressively sue to stop it happening, I just don't see how it could go through now.
No.
And what about, so we keep threatening to talk about Marvell. What's your thing?
Well, Marvell reported yesterday, really late, because they're California-based like most of these companies. Right. It's called Silicon Valley for a reason, obviously. Yeah. And they're a lot of the big chip companies in America. A lot of them are really interesting plays at the moment. You look at their performance. They're all on this ridiculous trajectory over the last sort of year, and obviously, when there's a supply crunch going on and you desperately need, and there's a huge amount of demand for chips, and everybody wants your stuff, it's kind of a good thing in a way, yeah.
Yeah. I don't think anyone in the chip sector's had a bad.
The chips industry is big. I think so. Marvell's share. I mentioned at the start of the thing. I think, but the Marvell share price is up more than threefold in the last since early 2020, basically, which is ridiculous. It's dramatic growth.
Wow.
And even in
and this is a company that's been around forever.
Well, it's a company that's been around, but it's grown a lot through acquisition, actually. It's bought a lot of things.
Can I just butt in? I'll tell you one really interesting bit of acquisition it did that I learnt about 10 or 15 years ago. Intel once did muck about with ARM microarchitecture.
Yeah.
And formed, I can't remember what the name of their little subunit was called, but it created a subunit that was ARM-y stuff. And then in the end it went, no, fuck it, we're going to just concentrate on x86. And it flogged its army stuff to Marvell back a decade or so ago.
Yeah, completely. And they've had a history of doing this. They built themselves into this business that's, Christ, I can't remember what their market cap's worth, but it's close to 60 billion at the moment.
Marvell?
Yeah.
Shall I look it up?
And they built themselves into this sort of company worth 60 billion through a series of takeovers. Whether it's someone like Innovium, which is another data center specialist, doing those sort of DPUs that you were talking about, or stuff more on the mobile side. I was very much looking at
Marvell's up 16% today.
Right. Yeah.
68 billion.
Oh yeah.
They are.
Thank you.
So I was well. It's even more obviously after the increase because it was.
Right now,
He's just looked at it on his phone.
Brilliant. So that's it's just an amazing kind of growth story. But I was very much looking at their results through the lens of 5G, which is a big thing for us, obviously more than covering some of the other markets that it's in. And their 5G business is their carrier infrastructure business. So that's sort of selling silicon to not to operators, but to vendors that sell to operators. Is about a fifth of sales at the moment. So it's not anywhere near the biggest thing they do, but it's turning into the growth engine. And you look at 5G, everybody goes on about 5G. There's been all this hype and excitement about 5G for years, and yet no one's really made any money out of it, have they? You look at Ericsson and Nokia's results. They're lucky to report single-digit percentage increases in revenues, aren't they? The service providers themselves, less than that. It's flattish. Marvell is up. Its 5G sales are up 30% year on year, and it's now forecasting for the fourth quarter 40% increase in basically in sales of 5G silicon for base stations is essentially what they're talking about, and a lot of it's come through this deal they've got with Nokia, and it actually stems from Intel's big cock up. So you go back to I think we talked about this on the pod a few times before, but you go back to the 2017, 2018. And Nokia was relying entirely on Intel for its sort of 5G silicon strategy. And it got let down. It got let down on this sort of 10 nanometer manufacturing process.
Just like Apple got let down as well.
And what that forced it to do is to fall back on these costlier chips called field programmable gate arrays, which it was buying from Xilinx. And the result of that was that they just basically lost competitiveness in the market. They couldn't really compete against Ericsson.
Because people didn't want to shell out whatever the claimed advantages of FPGAs were. People didn't want to shell out.
It just affected their margins. They just weren't competitive enough against people with customized silicon, which is what they've been trying to do, it seemed, with Intel. And so the initial response to that was to sort of go down this sort of FPGA route. And then they've got this guy in charge called Tommy Wito, who's head of the mobile business now. And what he's basically done is moved away from that very bad decision to have a single vendor strategy. I mean, we talk about this all the time. It shows what can happen with a single vendor strategy. You get let down by that one company, and they've basically lost competitiveness in the market for a couple of years.
It's massive, isn't it?
And what Wito's done is he's retained Intel, actually, but he's introduced two other companies alongside it as silicon suppliers. One's Broadcom, and the other one's Marvell. And a lot of the growth that they've seen in their business has been because of what they've got with Marvell. And it now seems like they're even increasing their share. So they've got those three players in the mix. From what they were saying on the earnings call yesterday, it sounds like they're even, Nokia's, it sounds almost like Nokia's relying more heavily on Marvell, or expects to rely more heavily on Marvell than it does on the others in the future. They've got this... what they're selling is they're selling baseband processors, basically transport processors. But even the CPU, the CEO was saying that Nokia wants to get CPUs from us in future, ARM-based CPUs, by the way.
Of course,
this Octium product they've got from 2024, and it's just basic. If you've got a deal with one of the three big equipment vendors on the planet, bearing in mind that Huawei develops its own base station silicon through HiSilicon, so it doesn't actually go shopping around at these companies, not that it'd be able to anyway these days. It's basically just completely transformed that carrier infrastructure business, and they're now using that as a kind of springboard to doing stuff in OpenRAN. So the same products that they've been developing for Nokia, they're hoping that they'll be able to position in the sort of OpenRAN market and sell as merchant silicon. So you can basically have a deal with someone like Benatel, which is a small Irish radio unit manufacturer, and sell exactly the same products they've been selling to Nokia, but on a sort of merchant silicon basis that would then sort of fit into that overall OpenRAN story.
Okay, so the general picture, and then I have to move it on because we're running out of time, is that the chip sector is just looking really exciting from a telecoms perspective, because it's just getting involved. We've spoken about OpenRAN, we've spoken about all these other little bits and bobs, and obviously chips. One of the reasons this chip issue that we've had globally has been such a big deal is because they're in fucking everything now.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as a pure sort of analog machine anymore.
Watch.
So yeah, like a pricey watch maybe. But most people, I bet you got an Apple Watch, haven't you?
No, nothing.
You got nothing. I'll let you off.
No, I don't like
No, nobody wears watches these days. Really.
I do, but I've got an old school watch. This is a wedding present. I didn't buy it.
I'll let you off.
So anyway, so yes, okay. I think that's really interesting and really worth keeping an eye on. But I think we can all agree that it's best off if ARM is not owned by another chip maker.
Totally.
Cool. So finally, we wanted to talk about. I keep forgetting what the final thing was. Remind me again. We had that European moaning big tech. That's it. Yeah. So the first thing that made me want to talk about big tech is a story I wrote. Let me just fire it up. Using my sort of typical sort of Scott, not very professional language, I said European operators have yet another collective moan was my headline.
Yeah.
And this is European operators as manifested through ETNO, which is a European Telecoms Trade Association. And so it's basically all the big ones in Europe, including even ones that aren't part of the EU, i.e. Vodafone. They went and wrote to whoever will listen. And what was it? The start of their letter was, we, the CEOs of Europe's leading telecommunications companies, call on EU policymakers to closely align Europe's digital ambitions with a supportive policy and regulatory ecosystem. So on one level, they at least haven't been begging directly for cash, or at least so it seemed at first. But they were just doing their standard thing of imploring. Sometimes it's they want looser policies when it comes to M&A. Sometimes they just want a bit more support when it comes to things like dealing with landlords and shit like that. Yeah. But they just basically just want some more help, and they always sort of get the world's smallest violin out and talk about fucking nightmare.
I mean, the things they're asking for are ridiculous, aren't they?
Well, so let me.
It's like a sort of Christmas wish list. Where your son asks for his first car.
Yeah.
We want to be allowed to merge. We want an internet neutrality, effectively. Yeah. And what was the other one? And spectrum should be free.
So their language was. I mean, I reproduce it in full. Their language was bullet point 1. There were 3 bullet points. A clear alignment between European digital leadership ambitions and competition policy. That's probably what you're saying about M&A. Second one was strong political buy-in to ensure that regulatory action fosters investment in gigabit networks, and there was a whole big write-up. I'm going to come into. I did my sort of TLDR distillation underneath. And then the third one said, a renewed effort to rebalance the relationship between global technology giants and the European digital ecosystem. And I said, if we had to summarize the 3 points, it'd be as follows. 1, let us collaborate more. Which obviously maybe I was a bit gentle there. Maybe I should have said let us do M&A more. 2, let us charge more for international calls. So that was reading between the lines what all that investment in gigabit network stuff. They basically think they're getting fleeced of some margin for I don't know, international calls or roaming or something. I think
there was also a reference to spectrum in number 2. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, it's a long old thing which I'm certainly not going to bore you or our audience with.
And the third one had the
yeah. So the third one was basically my characterization of it is make US tech giants give us money.
Yeah, because the third that included this sentence that things can only be sustainable if big tech platforms contribute fairly to network costs. Well, that's basically what net neutrality is all about. Not having big tech platforms paying for network usage.
Yes. So
they're essentially basically saying we want an internet neutrality, which has become a theme recently.
So long as it favours us. Yeah, and so we get all this moaning from operators. Like we had it in Korea with SK Telecom bitching about how many people were watching Squid Game on Netflix.
I think that's triggered this. I mean, Mark Alera at BT, the head of the consumer business, has been going on about this a lot recently. I even met him about it, and he was tweeting about it this week about his view that there needs to be this rebalancing, as they put it in that particular letter. But there's been this huge surge in internet traffic on networks, which is not surprising because everybody just sits at home these days worrying about getting Omicron, and while they're at home, all they do is watch Premier League football on broadband networks.
Yeah,
and therefore, what used to be sort of 13, 14 terabits per second peak level traffic was now, apparently Wednesday night, it was up at 25. It's the highest BT's ever seen on the network. And they're all of a sudden sort of starting to... Mark Alera says they're seeing problems on the network because of this, caused just by one or two platforms, the big tech, the Netflixes, the Amazons, these kinds of people.
Oh yeah, the Premier League was on Amazon Prime this week.
Yeah, and therefore what they think
people
is...
aren't watching it on ITV or
and he's saying for every extra terabit, it costs them millions each year in resolving this. Therefore, those companies should stump up some of the money.
I mean, I have some sympathy there. When you frame it that way, their network's being used, and if it's being used exceptionally, then that causes them problems. But it strikes me that the main problem is of their own making, which is how they sell this stuff, because it's uncapped.
Yeah,
and because they've probably all competed with each other to ensure that uncapped is the only viable way. I mean, who the fuck is going to buy a capped broadband contract now?
Yeah.
But, if it was capped, then when something like this is coming up and you were about to stream a Champions League football game on Amazon Prime, then you'd have to have a little think about it. They might even... Premier League, was it? Not Champions League, sorry. You'd have to have a little think about it, and maybe they'd even be able to set up little advanced messages going, look, if you think you're watching this, just so you know, it's going to use up 5 gigabits of your allowance.
Well,
I
think the Amazon Prime streaming this week that caused this huge spike. I mean, what was the match, Pierre?
The entire Premier League, whatever
they had a midweek
week was
they had a midweek session. I mean, look, they should have known this was coming anyway, right?
Against Man U, Pierre.
They would have known this was coming. This can't have been unexpected. That if you if you have an entire midweek session, knowing what happens with each football game,
it was Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday.
They would have known this was coming anyway. It's not something they couldn't prepare for.
Yeah, and this is what they do.
It also shows how many people have Amazon, like an Amazon Prime membership.
Yeah, this is the business they're in. I take your point. I don't think it's almost like they're trying to blame. It's just such a weird thing, because let's be honest, nobody would be on the internet, nobody would be subscribing to broadband services in the first place if it weren't for interesting companies like Amazon and Google that actually provide content on the internet. You don't just provide, you don't just subscribe to a broadband network because it's a broadband network.
Yeah,
it's because of what's on
Netflix.
it. So you could actually make an argument that the big tech's done them a favour. It's only because big tech's provided these gloriously wonderful, content service, TV and media packages that you can get now when you go online, that people have bothered to get subscriptions.
I think
in the
their real
first
complaint
place.
is that the way they charge for stuff hasn't kept pace with the way the world's evolved,
and that unfortunately is a problem of the operators making.
Yeah.
It's not something that this idea that internet companies should pay because the stuff that consumers are using gobbles up a lot of capacity. Well, they've already it's double charging basically, because they're already extracting money from the end customer for that fee. And then they're saying, well, the internet companies should pay as well. If they can't make a profit and they can't make it add up, then they need to have a look at how they price things. And they've all rushed to... They were responsible for this, because when they were desperate to try and attract people to broadband packages, and even more so, I would say, to what happened in mobile is even more dramatic. They went for years in the days of 3G, not really being able to figure out a sensible way of pricing 3G services, at a time when handsets weren't very compelling either. And there wasn't a lot of content actually to entice people. And one of the things that was done was to move to a more sort of flat rate system. And I just think they've sort of undermined the value of what they do. It's almost their fault in a way.
I agree. I'm just looking at some of the wording of the open letter they wrote regarding this last point about big tech and all that. And they have this usual stuff about how the only way this can happen is if we continually invest in the network. And then it goes, quote, this model, which enables EU citizens to enjoy the fruits of the digital transformation. So already they're trying to hold the politicians to ransom a little bit. Can only be sustainable if such big tech platforms also contribute fairly to network costs. Now that seems like a hell of a claim. So they're saying they can't even do it at all unless Amazon and Netflix and whoever.
Well, it's
chips
also
in.
the assumption that they don't contribute to network costs in itself slightly baffling. I mean, they have
do they?
huge data centers. Well, it depends what you regard as. Amazon and Google could come along and say, well, we have huge costs for running our data centers. And and the content that you get that's streamed over your networks comes from those. So you should chip in some data center costs.
If you're going to flip it,
Netflix could say we spend billions each year on content production, and it's only because of that content production that anybody subscribes to your service, BT.
No, you're completely
Why don't
right.
you come along and chip up
so
some
getting
content
the violin
costs?
out of like we're investing and everyone's benefiting it. Poor us, like they're doing it out of the goodness of their heart. Yeah,
I mean,
no, I think
where
it's
I've got
disingenuous.
sympathy for them is on that point is just daft, really. Where I've got some sympathy for them is on the M&A side of things, actually, and the spectrum side of things. I do think that I don't think European regulators have done themselves any favours. We can't hold European regulators up and say that they have done a marvellous job of looking after this sector over the last few years. There's been lots of things that you can criticise them for as well, and I think there's definitely a case that they've been maybe too restrictive on allowing companies to merge, and this insistence that every single market has to have 4 mobile networks for some reason I just find very bizarre.
Arbitrary.
It's quite arbitrary, and it just doesn't seem to be appropriate. I don't think it's actually I know why they're doing it, because they think it's good for the consumer, to have that sort of level of competition and have prices low. But in the long term, I'm not sure that it is good for the consumer. If it means that companies in Europe are investing less, let's say, in 5G rollout than they are in China and America, then at the end of the day, the consumer loses as well, if network investment suffers, and if we end up with poorer infrastructure, and if we don't benefit from some of these services that come online. So
I'll just say, to wrap it up, because I don't think we've got time to do any of the AWS stuff that happened this week justice.
Yeah.
Sorry, we've got one.
We can talk about it next week.
Yeah, we got one American fan who wrote in an email, both of us. I won't name him because it was an email. But he wanted to know what we thought about it, and I had to disappoint him and just say I haven't really looked into it enough. We were going to have a go at it now, but really this stuff's quite in the weeds, and we haven't got time to do it justice. But to wrap up this point, one thing I'll say, I'm sort of scathing and accusing them of moaning and that sort of thing. But one thing where I do have sympathy for them is, and this is at the root of a lot of their moans, is that they are a lot more regulated than other parts of the tech world.
Yeah.
Now, there's good reason for that, because the barriers to entry to being a telco are so high that you can't just manufacture competition. But they are heavily regulated, so they are going to have more of a moan about regulation than other industries.
Well, the other area where I'd have sympathy for them is on spectrum, actually, which they mentioned. I mean, clearly some countries have engineered spectrum auctions to just extract as much as possible without actually thinking whether this is a good thing. I mean, look at Italy. It's actually the outstanding example, if you want a recent one in 5G, where it was clearly done to just get money.
I think I
without
referred to
really
it as an
thinking,
orgy when I wrote it.
Yeah, and it wasn't, and they structured it in an odd way so that some companies were left with quite small holdings and other ones weren't. It was all clearly done to inflate the take.
Yeah,
and that's things like that shouldn't happen.
Yeah, that's extorting a sector just because they can.
Yeah,
totally. But I think we all agree that they're probably barking up the wrong tree in terms of insisting that the likes of Amazon and Netflix be forced to hand over money just because they're producing things that are popular with their customers. Cool. Right, we better wrap it up there. That's it. So I'll say thanks a lot for listening, and make sure you join us for the next one.